Across the globe, birth rates are falling, reaching historic lows. Is this a necessary correction for a world with limited resources, or are we heading towards an existential crisis? I'm Soraya Salam, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
People who are grieving, that's the word they use, grieving the families that they don't have. Now, this is a hidden crisis. People who are grieving childlessness aren't doing it on the streets. They're not coming onto talk shows like this.
I think the idea that I should get married and have children after my personality is fully developed is a very modern idea, and it's one that we don't challenge very often.
So if more men could be fathers and could be part of being fathers, I do think that the world would be a more peaceful place. They would have less hormones and energy to be seeking wars and seeking violence and seeking fights.
But it's an oversimplification and a harmful one at that when we say that we owe or not owe children, because that implies that you should have them, that it's somehow shameful or blameful if you don't.
Our debate today: do you owe the world a child? I'd like to welcome our guests. Stephen Shaw, data scientist and director of the documentary film series Birth Gap. Laurie DeRose, senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. Alaka Basu, professor of global development at Cornell University. And Antonina Lewandowska, feminist activist and researcher. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited about this discussion. Laurie, starting with you, do we owe the world a child? Should it be seen as a moral obligation to create the next generation?
We owe the world children. I'm changing the question. I'm saying that it's we collectively that owe the world children. It is not an individual moral obligation. There are plenty of moral people who have not had children. It doesn't define us as human or as righteous, but a healthy age structure is in the public good, and there are lots of things about children that contribute to society. So we collectively need them, and collectively we need to produce them.
Alaka?
I don't think we owe the world children, and for several reasons. For one thing, I'm a bit alarmed at the way until 10 years ago we were all screaming about the population explosion, and now it seems to be a mirror image of the opposite way we're as concerned. We got over the population explosion, and now we are disappointed that we got over it too far. I mean, we've gone too far. And I don't think in either case, for one thing, I don't think we have a population problem, a problem of declining population that we need to worry about right now. And the second thing is, I don't think I agree with Laurie that one can think about it as a collective responsibility, but eventually it boils down to the behavior of individuals, and which means that it's really women who are at the receiving end of any kind of pressure to have a child,
Stephen?
just like they were under pressure not to have children in the past.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with the idea of anyone owing anyone a child. I don't think we need to be framing it in that way, frankly. It so happens that, I guess, through nature, most of us want to have children. The vast majority of us do. And I think that allows us to reframe this question to simply look at, are those people who want to have children having them, able to have them, aware of the information that would perhaps enable them to make better personal decisions about their lives? I think that's the subject matter, not in terms of owing anybody anything. The reality is, if people were having the number of children they want to have, and if fewer people were what I term becoming unplanned childlessness, we wouldn't have a birth rate crisis at all.
Antonina?
I agree with the concern about the framing of the question, because I feel that saying that we owe children to anyone basically reduces them to a commodity that we should be providing. And that's not the case. What I believe should be considered in that regard is that we owe people creating a space that is welcoming and supportive of being parents, and of having planned children and of having loving families. But it's an oversimplification and a harmful one at that when we say that we owe or not owe children, because that implies that you should have them, that it's somehow shameful or blameful if you don't. That's one thing. And the other is having children is one thing, and creating a loving, supportive family is another. And it's not enough for us to have children to keep the world in a shape as we wish to see it around us, because we need loving, supportive families. We need financial resources to bring up these children. And there is so many different factors at work that definitely I strongly disagree with the phrasing of the question.
I mean, could I just also add? I think there's another framing issue here because the question implies that we can just choose randomly to have a child, particularly as women, but obviously it involves men too. It's not that simple. Things have to line up, including finding a partner, finding stability in your life. So the idea that we can say we owe people, the world, children, again, it is a vast oversimplification as to how complex this issue is.
And yet you did call it a crisis. I want to just read a quick statistic. By 2050, over 3/4 of countries will not have high enough fertility rates to sustain population size over time. This will increase to more than 95% of countries by 2100. That's according to the Lancet Medical Journal. So what consequences could this have? Should
And
we be worried?
yeah, most of this is already baked in, certainly the 2050 number, simply because there's already so fewer potential parents in many countries in the more developed world and increasingly in the less developed world. So we cannot change that outcome even if we wanted to. So for example, Japan, where I live, if births were to go up to replacement level, it's a horrible term, but it's what we mean for the average family size being around 2 children per woman. If that were to happen tomorrow, and of course it won't, total population in Japan would still be destined to fall by half, simply because of the children that were not had over the past 5 or more decades. So the consequences, to more directly answer your question, touch, I would say, everything. I mean, I would struggle to think of anything that they will not impact. And some of those things, you may say, might be good things. There might be less stress on the planet, but it still will have an impact. Most of the things socially and economically are negative, potentially very negative. We've built our economies on growth. Like it or not, that's what we have today. And it starts with how we invest, how we create companies, how we sell products on one side. And it's quite cold to talk about that, perhaps in terms of birth rates, but it's reality. It ends up with how we support older people, how we support pensions, and how we support the healthcare of older people. Because the vast majority of expense related to healthcare is focused on the over 70s, the over 75s. And we're looking at a world, like it or not, where we're going to be poorer in one way or another because of this. And again, we can't change this for the decades ahead in many, many nations. So we have to adjust, we have to accept it. We have to, I think more than anything, educate younger people as to the future that they're going to have.
Laurie, I'm wondering, why are we seeing this trend in so many countries? Is it simply that people are choosing not to have as many children, or not to have children at all? Or are there other factors at play, like, healthcare, economic driving, economic motivators? What are some of the reasons we're seeing this?
Well, Stephen, I think you were right on the money when you said that a lot of people are involuntarily childless. And I do think that that has a lot to do with the economy, with instability. It used to be that instability caused people to want to have lots of children for insurance and for old age support and all that, but that's like chronic poverty. What the kind of instability we have with pandemics and financial crises and the like creates is ooh, what does the future hold? Not, I'm going to be poor my whole life, how do I cope with it? But is now the right time to have a child? And once you couple that with the matchmaking part, have I found the right partner? I think that we have economic structures that make it harder to have children. We have work-family policy that doesn't promote childbearing as much as it should. But I would also add that I think we have a maximizing kind of mentality. I've got to get this life project right and do it in the best possible way. and that's not really reality, that living life as opposed to figuring out the best way to live life on some path where I will defer gratification of the children that I say I want. Well, do I really want them that much if I'm willing to put them off 20 years for my career? So I know I threw a lot in there, but it was saying that the political structures keep people from having children, but so do ideologies, and so does crisis, but so do maximizing individualism.
I'm listening to you, Laurie, and I'm coming back to a conversation that I had with a friend of mine some time ago. And she was in a job interview. And she told me that she was asked, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" And she actually laughed in the interviewer's face because it's so uncertain now. We are used to getting that question. But she told me, in the last 5 years, I've been through a pandemic, a war that started just abroad since I'm Polish, and the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion affects us all. There is so much instability economically on the market, everything that is going on around us, also with climate change, which we have to remember that climate crisis plays a huge role in that decision to either postpone or actually give up on having children altogether. It's a whole group of young people that decide, I do not want my future child to possibly die in war over water, which is an actual concern for many people. And so I would say that, yes, that instability and the situation on the globe is one thing that we need to concern. But also, I heard you, Stephen, when you mentioned that our economy is based on growth, no question about that. But at the same time, we have propositions from economists who say, how about degrowth? How about reshaping the way that we think about economy? And there is this terrific young economist, Timothée Parik. I don't speak French, but I hope I'm not mispronouncing the name. And he has this huge analysis on how we propose degrowth, not as a chaotic, uncontrolled recession, but as a plan that is supposed to adjust to our lived reality. Because let's be honest, the current situation economically and how we talk about expectations from people is outdated given the lived realities of so many people around the world, regardless of the region. So I would say that the discussion about childlessness or child freedom, which is also a thing that we have a new word for the decision to not have children.
Sure
Some people
do.
call themselves child free, which is interesting in itself.
Which I don't like, but maybe we can come on to that.
No, I understand it, but it's still a fact that many people describe themselves as child free, regardless of how we feel about that. It's a decision. It's possibly, could we call it a lifestyle? I don't really know, but it's something that we have to consider, that there is this huge group that, given all the factors that we are mentioning here, they decide that they withdraw themselves altogether from that game. And I believe it's their right to do so.
Oh, I do too. I just don't like the term,
Mhm.
child and free, putting those together is unusual. The word free is usually used for universal negatives, that we're enslaved to debt free, stress free. This is the only example. We don't say pet free. I don't have a dog. I'm not pet free. I think it's, I would use a term like aparental, someone who just doesn't want to be a parent, and we should respect that.
And
I know-
fair, but at the same time, if we think about it, child free for these people, I'm not a child free person. I will be having children very soon. But I have friends who describe themselves as child free, and they say that this is freedom from stress, from expectation, from pressure that they could feel, from resignation, from parts of their life that they just want to keep. So for them, child freedom, while I understand your point about possible negativity of the term, is still something positive for them. But then again, that comes to the public debate and how we talk about childlessness/child freedom.
Well, if I could on that point, if you can imagine, for example, a 6-year-old child asking their teacher if they have children, and the teacher saying, "No, I'm child free." What would that 6-year-old think going home? Mommy and daddy, did you want to be child free? I don't think it's the right word. I think there are better terms to describe this, and we don't have to use that term. It was introduced by ideologists, and it's crept into academia. Unfortunately, it's crept into the media, and we're using it here. So I'm trying to always flag. There are better terms, there are fairer terms,
But
and
free,
aparental.
but free does come from freedom. Yeah, I mean, if you treat it as coming from the word freedom, then the freedom is not a negative thing. So to have the freedom not to have children because you think that's not what works for you, I think there's nothing wrong with calling it child free, because you are exercising the freedom to have a different kind of life. You don't have to be, we assume that everyone wants to be a parent, everyone wants to be a mother, and we attribute the even the voluntary childlessness to something deeper, not finding a partner, etc., or not, for example, finding gender equality and being lumped with either looking after domestic duties as well as going out to work. But it could also be, and I think there is some evidence from, I was just last week reading a paper in population studies, I think, about women who, in fact, groups who, this was in Scandinavian countries, groups that women who actually experience the largest amount of gender equality, in fact, have also moved on to think that then childbearing is not the part that I'm not being restrained from having children because my partner is willing to help me. But in fact, the gender equality that I have has reminded me that there are many things in life besides having children. And I've changed my views, I've changed my goals, I've changed my aspirations. I can get satisfaction. I myself have children, so I'm not speaking at a personal level, but I fully understand friends who think that their life goals and their interests in life can be very separate, don't depend on having a child.
I really resonate with what you're saying, Alaka, because child freedom, I'm going to side with the idea it has some negative stuff in it, but I just want to draw out part of what you said. There's this literature and demography that she and I are very familiar with, and that maybe not everyone else is, that basically says that one of the big problems with low fertility is sexism. That if men and women raised children together and reproductive and productive burdens were borne by men and women, that there would be more children. And there is empirical evidence showing that. And yet you say, and in one person's personal life, and I'm sure she's not singular, that freedom meant, oh, even though I wouldn't have to be the primary caregiver, I still don't want children. So I really get that the doctrine that says, oh, gender equality is the path toward children doesn't necessarily have to end in children for everyone. But when we use freedom to describe that, we are labeling kids as a negative.
Yes.
I don't think we can really avoid that. I think we have to pay attention to how we think about children. And I think a lot of cultures, and especially developed ones, talk about them as a burden or as some kind of, oh, children are so rewarding. They're the most rewarding thing you can do in your life. I had my first son when I was 25. Nobody told me how much fun it would be. They all told me how rewarding it would be. I look back and I'm like, why in the world did I want to have kids if no one told me they were this delightful? I think we need to talk about kids as if they're delightful, and we need to recognize that we're better people if we're not self-centered. And I'm not saying that everyone who's a parent becomes less selfish. There are some damn selfish parents in the world. And I'm also not saying that people who aren't parents don't develop selflessness, because we could point at lots of lovely examples of that too. I don't think anyone would say Mother Teresa was selfish. I think we need to tread in the place where we recognize that child freedom is freedom, but it's freedom from a social script that says that kids are an albatross and not that describes children in their totality.
Just to clarify, so were you saying that more gender equality leads to more children?
There is some empirical evidence showing that, yes.
Okay. And as the only man at the table, Stephen, what role do men play in addressing what you consider a crisis?
Yeah, and we don't talk about men enough. Here we are, and I can cite endless amounts of data, as I'm sure all the other panelists can, and it'll be almost certainly predominantly about women and children per women and childlessness of women. It's very unfortunate. The reason is that we have so much data related to births and the mother. We just don't have enough data, but I am able to share something from my latest research that, the trends for men and women are exceptionally similar. Men seem to have this idea that they can delay things longer than women. It's only by a very few years. In reality, if you look at outcomes, so I would say that everything we're talking about around this table applies effectively as equally to men as it does women. And I really would call out to men watching to really stop the delusion that we can wait until our 40s, 50s, and that because we biologically mostly still can become fathers at that age. The reality is that the vast majority of men without children at those ages do not become fathers, often because they just don't meet the right younger woman in that case to become a parent.
Yeah, but I'd like
Please.
to say actually something. Talking about men, I almost think that men need to become fathers much more than women need to become mothers. I do think that there is a crisis of maleness and masculinity, etc., taking place right now, and I do think that the large number of men who are childless, in fact, there are more men who are childless than women who are childless, uh, might be working against men as opposed to working against women. And partly because I think, there is some physiological evidence that fatherhood makes for a more gentle man. Maybe the levels of testosterone come down because you caring for another person, taking responsibility for a child is actually weakens your tendencies to anger and violence, etc. So if more men could be fathers and could be part of being fathers, I do think that the world would be a more peaceful place. They would have less hormones and energy to be seeking wars and seeking violence and seeking fights. So I think, in fact, children are men, even if they don't realize it and abandon their children and their mothers, need, if we are going to tell people about the value of children, we need to be telling that more to the men than to the women. Women, in fact, I think, have bear such a big burden of childbearing that they can see the negatives. Men have been able to think they've got away scot free, but they're the losers in the process. I think fatherhood is good for men more than motherhood is good for women, is my
I,
sense.
I'm not sure I could agree with that. I mean, if you look at in the US, I'm sure you're familiar with the CDC National Family Growth Survey. Thousands of women and men interviewed mostly in their homes over many, many decades. We're finding that somewhere around 90, even 95% of women in their fertile years either have or want children. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, frankly, on those people who don't want children. I think mostly we're agreeing that we should respect that. I certainly do.
Or people
But
who can't have children and want,
yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah.
That's where the real issue is here when it links to birth rates. So I don't dispute what you said. Maybe, certainly, I see younger men now in their 20s, often lost career-wise, lost educationally, just lost in life. That may be linked to the fact that they would more normally want to be fathers at that age. It might be. But the real issue here comes back to those people who want to become parents, significantly, certainly women who are childless for life.
What about what Antonina brought up earlier about why not just recalibrate to a world with fewer children?
Well, we're going to have to, in some
Well, it's
ways.
inevitable.
Degrowth
We
is
have
right.
to do it.
The reality is, developed economies and increasingly developing economies are going to have to confront degrowth. And, when I studied an MBA 30 years ago, I think every single class we took was about growth in some context. I'm not sure that has changed anywhere, but it's going to be about how to manage degrowth. And that's not going to be easy. That's not just something that we can sit around this table and say, yes, let's do that. There's going to be a lot of societal and economic challenges. But in terms of accepting long-term low fertility, in doing that, we're actually accepting that it doesn't matter in our societies that actually the majority of childless people actually wanted to become parents. We're just going to ignore that. If we are caring people, we would want to address that. Whether that's a big number or small number, we can get into the details of that. We should be caring about those people. And the data certainly, I would say, would show that we will not have a birth rate problem. We will get to a point in future, decades from now, stability in terms of populations, where populations are not shrinking and not growing equally. That to me is the goal, but that's 50 years away, best case.
Easily.
Yeah. Antonina, I mean, he brings up a point of, should we, from a societal level, should we care that people are having fewer children. How do you respond to that?
I would say that the discussion that we are having is, at least for now, partially focuses on individual choices, which is one thing, but we don't live in a void. And each of us as an individual lives in a system, in a society. And the system is failing currently. It's failing people that want to have children. It's failing people that either struggle with infertility, and the healthcare system is still underfunded grossly around the world. And people simply don't have the resources sometimes to get help. So that is something that we should definitely focus on more. We should focus on developing education as well, because at least in some cases, it was noted that the decision to postpone or withdraw from the decision of having children altogether also comes from the concern for that children's future, with the constant pressure on growth, on that race towards being bigger and better and more developed, and it just goes on indefinitely. People start to worry that, well, I don't have the resources to equip my child in abilities and the resources that could be beneficiary to them in the future, and
In a
that would
scary
possibly mean
future.
that they would be worse off. And so if I do not have that reassurance that I can pay for private English lessons, that I can pay for my child playing fluently the piano by the age of 5, if they are not a prodigy, then that means that I failed as a person and as a parent. And there is this concern. And so degrowth and that approach, the systemic approach, should be refocused on well-being and on care. And that is something that we are not discussing enough. I don't mean at this table, but in general, that the economy of well-being is something that is being brought up repeatedly in the international community, but it's still not being introduced, with some exceptions, maybe in the Nordic countries. And so I would say that yes, of course, we should be focusing on that drop in fertility, but in the point of caring about the system and creating a supportive environment rather than putting pressure on an individual. And that's interesting and brings me to another point that I actually noted down, which is the gendered political gap. And that's interesting because there is some data, in Poland at least, that suggests that the majority of people do want to have a child, possibly preferably two. That's the preferred number in Poland for the people that are childless at the starting point. But then after the first child is born, among women, the number drastically drops. And so they do not want to have another child, while the percentage remains similar among men. And that resonates with what was brought up about that gendered division of care and of labor that is being put into upbringing. But then again, how are we going to work towards more families, more communities, more children with that drastic political division between genders? Because we are very clearly seeing that women are currently leaning towards the left, so to speak, or democratic values, while many young men are actually leaning towards the right and the conservative. And so how do we create families? How do we create couples when people just don't get along? And that's something that we still have to consider and figure out as well.
I think education has a huge role here. I think one of the most simple things to at least start the possibility of solving this crisis is to better educate young people, men and women, on sex education. And what I mean by that, I mean holistic sex education. Now, today in many countries around the world, we have what's called comprehensive sex education. And when I first heard of this, I thought that was a good thing. It is, but it's not complete. What we don't do a good job of, I believe in any country I've experience of, we don't tell young people about the fertility window, about how long there might be to have a child. And we have data for this that we're actually ignoring. So for example, in the UK today, I have recent data in the UK, a woman turning 28 in the UK this year has a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother at age 28, based on fertility records, based on the age that actually people are having children today. That might change in future, but historically, it doesn't change.
But why?
Well, this is the big question, because 28 is too young for biological factors to really be an issue. But let me explain that this peak age, say 28 in the UK, around 26 in Japan, of the timing when people are likely to become a mother, forms a very clear curve, a predictive curve, So my own research now, I don't look at Poland, I don't look at the US, I don't look at countries. I've got 39 countries of data, 300 million mothers. And can predict the likelihood of parenthood to 94% predictive strength correlation, simply from the age of motherhood and the spread. Everything here comes back to delaying parenthood causing, I'm going to use a strong word statistically, causing, because it's so clear in the data, causing a drop in the likelihood of ever becoming a parent. Now, and that's before biology kicks in. When you get to countries like South Korea, where parenthood is so late, you get 40% of women today having one child only, much higher than, say, Japan, which is 20%. It's clear that there are some biological barriers starting to kick in when people in Korea are having, I think the average age is 32 there now. So why is it that we have this peak and this sudden drop-off? But it's real, it's there. You can look at the data. I call it the vitality curve. It's my new word for this curve, this smooth curve. There are no bumps of people having children, mid-30s. We might dream of that societies. It doesn't happen anywhere. There's no bump from IVF. And of course, people are succeeding from IVF. But what I think has happened from the advancement of these fertility technologies, we're encouraging young people, one way or another, to delay parent. And for every woman or future father who succeeds through IVF, I believe there's 2 or 3 or 4 who failed, who thought, well, it will be okay at that point.
But that's right now. Technology is moving ahead very rapidly. Let's not forget that. Every time we've come up with dystopian images of the future in the past, when it was Malthusian, when everyone was worried there wouldn't be enough food, we had an agricultural revolution. Then we had an industrial revolution. Now we've got this technological revolution in assisted reproductive technologies, and we're at the start of that. I wouldn't be surprised, given the need, if it is true that women do want children, and that the few who say they don't are an aberration, which I don't think they are. I don't think they're an aberration. But if the women do want children, and we want to support them to have the children they have, of course we need to work at the level of contemporary practical supports in terms of childcare and health services, etc. But we should also remember that technology, that's one of the few positives of the capitalist mode of development. Technology is there to meet that demand, and it's moving very rapidly. And I wouldn't be surprised if 15 years from now the IVF success rate shoots up. And so right now it's true that it's still very low, but there's no reason to think that technology and the innovation, the brilliance that exists in this world, in the technological world, isn't going to catch on to the market that exists and not going to create a supply. So the postponement of births again, at one level, yeah, I also find it amusing that all these things we are saying, we said exactly the same thing for the opposite problem when we had too many children being born. We talked about sex education, we talked about education, we talked about technology,
Mhm.
we said all these things of contraceptive technology, and now we are talking about IVF technology. But contraceptive technology met the demand, and that's why birth rates came down. And now I think ARTs are going to eventually meet the demand. And also the delaying of births, it's true, there is an age curve of fertility, of fecundity or fertility. That's true. But the delaying of births, when your life expectancy was 50 or 60, is a very different story from the delaying of births when you can expect to live to the age of 80, and over time again able to have a healthy life, what they call a healthy life expectancy. If you have your first child at 35, but you are going to remain pretty fit as a parent to the age of 70, it's equivalent to having a child at the age of 25, but dying by the age of 50. So the delaying of fertility again is, again, I'm not a biologist, but I think that from the social point of view, one shouldn't over worry about it.
So, Stephen, do you accept technology will come to the rescue?
No. So I'm going to be bold here with respect to Alaka, and I'm going to make a prediction that it won't, because we've got decades of data. We've got decades from countries that have had technologies, and you would expect by now to see some uptick, and it's just not happening. So for me, actually, the question shifts, not contradicting, I think, anything you've said, that there's something else driving this. There's something deeper, and that something deeper, I think, is people not having a partner at the right time. So you get to 38, you've frozen your eggs, everything could work out, but you just had a divorce.
No, I agree with that.
Laurie?
Yeah, I really like the way this conversation is coming around to talking about biology and people's longings. I want to remind people, as a sociologist, that even what we long for is socially constructed. We can't say that 95% of people naturally want children. I don't know what percent of people naturally want children. I know that society can teach them that they don't, or that society can teach them that they do. And similarly, with the idea of delaying childbearing, do we really want to? And I'm putting it forward sort of as a practical consideration that, well, I'm preaching interdependence. If we are interdependent with each other as a society, do we want people to grow up being child-free for 35, 40, 50 years because they don't change in the way that they would if they were forced into selflessness? And I say forced tentatively because I'm not intending to imply coercion. I'm pulling on the more philosophical stuff at this point. My first son is a philosopher. He's got a tenure track position straight out of graduate school. I'm very proud of him. And when I was thinking about this debate, I found myself looking at like Aristotle and thinking, oh, Todd would be proud of me that I'm doing this. But it's true that Aristotle said things like, children are neither necessary nor sufficient to make us into social animals. We are social animals. We are interdependent. Being children doesn't make us that. It helps because we're doing something outside of ourselves, outside of our life project, something bigger than ourselves. But it takes a healthier independence with society, not just within your family, to actualize that in an even more human way.
What about that kind of what you're getting at? I'm also thinking about generational continuity. How does a society grapple with preserving traditions, culture, if there is that break in the chain?
Well, a 40-year delay is not necessarily a break. Am I missing the point of your question?
Well, I guess what I mean is it kind of goes back to what Stephen was saying. I'd love to hear what you think, Antonina, about this fact that, if people are having fewer children or choosing not to have children, is that eventually creating a society in which people aren't passing down tradition, culture, and in that kind of break in generational inheritance?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so because we've had historically situations where the younger generation was eradicated for whatever reason. Say it was a war or it was a pandemic or something happened, and it's not that we lost or all that was around us, the culture, the history. So I think there are ways, especially as a person that's coming from Poland, our history is very twisted and complicated. We actually didn't exist on a map for 123 years. And so many would say that, well, the nation must have collapsed. And that wasn't the case. Actually, when we regained our independence after the First World War, the culture was booming. And there was so much that people were sharing despite coming technically from different countries because there were partitions and they were living in different nations that actually, took us over. So that's not the case that the culture would disappear because we always pass down something. We have written resources. We have digital resources now. Many people are seeking their heritage and then trying to unpack it, figure out, and carry on with traditions that they may have not even known in their childhood. It's often a case for adopted children, for people who are trying to seek their roots, and then they just adopt it and carry on with who they feel they are. That's one thing. And the other is we also come up with new traditions. Each and every family, I'm very sure that every person in this room and all of the viewers have their own small traditions that they pass on. Of course, it's not a cultural code that everyone would universally share and agree on. But at the same time, it's not that it doesn't exist, because society is created and upheld by our participation in it and our activities. So it's not about losing something, it's about constant redefining and finding that new common and shared ground. So that's one thing. And the other, Laurie, I wanted to get back to what she said about.
Can I just, before you get to a new point, get to comment on your thing? I agree with her, because one can say the fear of cultural breakdown, or not intergenerational transmission breaking down, was that fear has been expressed at any major
Yes.
social change, modern education, urbanization, liberal values in terms of sexual partnerships. All these things have been treated at some point or the other as breaking the chain of intergenerational cultural transmission. But we recover, we bounce back. Some things I think deserve to be abandoned. We have a lot of culture that we should be embarrassed about, and other things that we think are valuable. In fact, again, we are learning to go back and get them and revive them. And so culture, I don't think ever disappears. It gets modified, it adapts, and some things, if some parts of it, as I say, if they disappear, there's no problem with that.
But do we have anything to lose in a world with fewer children? Just kind of off the back of your point. I mean, do we have, on a collective societal level, do we have anything to lose in a world with fewer children?
Maybe we should go back to the first point. What do we mean by fewer children? Do we mean fewer children in the world, or fewer children in specific countries and specific parts of the world? Because all estimates suggest that we are still going to go up to some 10 billion, and at the global level, the population is continuing to grow. It's true, it's not growing in the Western world, but it's growing in the other parts. It's going to reach 10 billion, which is not a small number. And at one time, we were horrified when people who talked about what the optimum world population should be, the extremists went to, like Paul Ehrlich and others, said it should be 2 billion. Then there were others who said 5 and 6 billion. If we go up to 10 billion, even if we start declining, we are still going to be well above what we were in 1950, say. And it wasn't a bad time, 1950. The 2000 wasn't a bad time, when it was about 6 billion people in the world. So if you think about it at a global level, I don't think that's a worry. The problem, of course, is that we don't want to think about it at a global level. Each of us has our little islands, whether that island is a country, or my family, or my community, or my religion. And so we are talking more in terms of that level of concern, that are there too few of me, my kind? We are not talking about are there too few people. And so that is a different conversation that we should be having in terms of how we then deal with the problem of too few births.
But is that, I mean, can you expand on what you mean by that?
Yeah, because it's become most of it is, I mean, if we are going to talk about fewer births, it's true, births are coming down everywhere, including in sub-Saharan Africa. There's no question about that. Birth rates are coming down, but as I said, the total population is not coming down at a global level. But the point, I have 2 points actually. One is the degrowth. I think we need to change our parameters of what it's. Most of the concern about fewer births comes from economists who cannot think outside the idea of continuous growth. GDP, is it growing by 2%? Is it growing by 3%? But I think there's a case to be made in rich countries for slowing down. So if the economist argument concern is about growing too fast economically, that argument, I think it's time we consider slowing down in both production and consumption and destruction of the environment. So that's one part of it. But the other part is really there are many kinds of, so growing slower is not such a bad thing. I think Africa needs to grow more because they have limited, they still do very badly on many fronts. But a continuous rise in income, I don't think should be the parameter on which we decide that having fewer children, having fewer babies is bad for the world economy. And secondly, I think we need to think about ways that we adapt to lower, fewer births, that again adapt to fewer births which are voluntarily fewer births. I don't think that I don't mean that we don't help women who want children have children. If there are ways to adapt, the most obvious one, of course, is a redistribution of the population, immigration, but that's going to have that has lots of issues as we are seeing right now. But there are other forms of adaptation. Degrowth is one, but there are many others which I hope we'll talk about.
Stephen, we should just adapt. I mean, the world's going to be 10 billion soon, right?
Yeah, I think this goes to the heart of a lot of, frankly, misunderstandings about population. I mean, population dynamics are complex. We tend to think in terms of static systems. We tend to think in terms of things like gliding down or gliding up. Population dynamics just simply don't work that way. That's how we got growth in the first place. People started having large number of families, and then those larger number of families had themselves more large families. And very quickly we went from 1 billion up to 8, maybe 10 billion. And you say rightly that, in the 2050 or 2100, I think we're going to have still 7 or 8 billion people. So what's the problem? The problem is most of those people are going to be old. It's not like 1950 numbers. We're going to have a much shrunken, younger base and this large, older base to support. Now, we need to think about that, but we can't say they're the same. But in terms of births, let me just share some data that the total number of births on the planet peaked in 2013. So we're already on this path, including sub-Saharan Africa. But let's look at one country that people jump to a lot, which is India, which overtook China to become the most populous country on the planet a very few years ago. And people worry about India. How can it support its people? Births in India peaked in 2001. We're almost 25 years into a drop in births in India. 32 out of the 36 states in India have below replacement fertility. If you go to the south, many of those states have the same low birth rates as Europe. So if you go to Tamil Nadu, for example, I believe it's 1.5, and it's been that since the 1990s. So we can see already in the data a humanitarian crisis unfolding in India of too few younger people to support the older population a generation from now. And the same thing's happening in Latin America. I mean, it's simple numbers. Now, unless we start thinking about how India, with its rapidly shrinking births, is going to support its rapidly increasing older population, given people are thankfully living longer there, we're just letting a humanitarian crisis on which we're totally unprepared for. It's simple.
Alaka, you're
No, no,
shaking
no,
your
no,
head.
no. I have to take this on. India, fortunately, is a big country. In fact, what one can say about India is what I would have liked to say about the world. And it's growing different parts. It's true in South India, birth rates are very low, but in North and Central India, they're still very high. So this staggered fertility decline, in fact, has worked in a way that we're able to cope because the Central India and North India have too many people of working age and not enough work for them. South India has too few people. But then because it's one country and people can move across borders, we have the extra labor from the north going to the south. So all the workers in the south come from the north, whether it's in construction or transportation or whatever. So and so this is exactly the point I was making. If we could have an ideal world in which the borders were less important, just like within India they're less important, maybe we could have more African work. Some of the pressure of population in African countries released by being used to meet the demand for labor in the Western world. So, in the Indian case in particular, I think right now it's still 1.4 billion. It's going to rise to 1.5 or 1.6 billion before it starts tapering off. So I don't think India as yet. This is the trouble with the Western paradigm. Everyone follows it now. Indians have suddenly begun saying, "Oh, are we having too few births now? We should encourage people to have more children." There's one group that says that. There's another group, of course, which focuses on who is having the more children and less. Is it the Muslims? Is it the low caste? Is it the less educated? And that's where we need to. So the it's all very very antagonistic. The debate becomes about it's the who, as I said. Is it people like us who are not having enough children, Or do we mean that the whole country is not having? That's not what we
I,
are saying.
I think we could answer that. Almost certainly, it's the poorest who are having the larger families, irrespective of what religion or
Yes.
caste they are. And that may well be Muslims, and that may well be lower caste, but it's poverty that's the driver. What I would say, though, is I don't think this needs to be antagonistic. I think the reality is total births across all of India are down 20%. And right now, you're absolutely right. There'll be enough workers from the north to travel to the south, but that's not going to last very long.
Yeah,
Exactly.
which is fine.
Yeah, that was actually what I was thinking too. Because when I was thinking about this on the global scale, there were two things that were standing out to me. One is just as a demographer, our training is immigration can't solve an unhealthy age structure problem. You've described a top-heavy age structure. And if you put in some workers from abroad at the middle ages, that's great. It makes the workforce more productive again. And that's what I hear you saying for North-South India. But those people become elderly 40 years later. If they came at 20, okay, 50 years later, 60 years later. But I also just wanted to tie this back to what Antonina was saying, because there's sort of a few different solutions to an unhealthy age structure problem. One is, of course, have more births. And another one is substitute technology for people. And another one's immigration. And at least from my understanding, all of those are somewhat problematic because immigration is a short-run solution. If we want prosperity and education and the good life for our kids, we want it for everybody. We don't want it just for the upper class. So we don't want there to be some lower strata that are motivated by their poverty to have kids to create the workforce, and not just for racist reasons. It's not just that there won't be enough people like me, whoever I am, whether I'm Indian or I'm white or whatever. It's that it's harder to create what Antonina was talking about, those stable families with adoption and with immigration than it is biologically. And I may sound tremendously traditional when I say that, but all I'm really saying is doing it biologically is easier. Immigration requires a lot of social reshuffling. Adoption has its own challenges. They are both beautiful things. I definitely don't want to be heard saying that these less natural processes like adoption and immigration are somehow inferior to biological parenthood. But biological parenthood gives you a huge reason to invest in your children. You're more concerned about the future for the sake of your children. And you're right, some people are saying, and I'm not taking that burden on. It's too scary. I'm not going to invest in an uncertain world. But I think we have to bring this back to marriage, too, which, again, is getting really conservative. But you've been saying people don't necessarily have a partner at the right time in life. Well, we've devalued marriage as an institution. And it's kind of not surprising that if it can't be counted on for stable families, that it doesn't help produce stable families the way it did in the past. I mean, marriage is non-biological too. It's hard, like adoption and immigration, because it's non-biological. But I'm making the argument that we can socially support it, just like we can socially support childbearing with gender egalitarianism and with generous work-family policy. We can support marriage ideologically and policy-wise as well.
Antonina, do you accept her characterization of stable families?
I honestly made so many mental notes that I'm getting confused in my own head now. But just to unpack it, I don't think that marriage guarantees a stable
It
family
doesn't.
life. I don't think that marriage is necessary to have children. And I believe that deterioration of marriage that we are mentioning now has its cause, it has a root. And so the state of abuse that was present in marriage as an institution for a very long time, the fact that it may be difficult to leave your partner when you don't want to be in that committed relationship anymore is also an issue. And so, as we agreed on already, society is created and it's being upheld by our beliefs and it's shaped by our actions. And so that decline in the number of marriages, it didn't happen in a void. It didn't appear out of the blue. And so I wouldn't say that marriage guarantees. I don't think that it's necessary. I think that people may be in a formal relationship, they may be in an informal relationship, and that's fine because whatever works for them. Some people feel safer when they are not married. And that's also the case for example, for some abuse survivors who
Yes.
have this feeling that I want to feel that I can leave when I want to without the necessity to explain myself to a judge or a public officer. And that's also the case. So if we want to support stable families, if we want to create that friendly environment, we have to take that into account. So I wouldn't tie that discussion to marriage itself. That is another issue, how politicized some aspects of reproduction are. Which brings me to the point that I wanted to make on what you said, Laurie, because if I remember correctly, because that was some time ago, you mentioned that some people may feel coerced or forced to be childless, somehow deceived because that there was a promise made. That's how I read what she said. Maybe I was wrong, but I have this feeling that the discussion is very binary, very pro and con, that it's either this or that. And we are losing the middle ground. We are losing the fun part of parenthood that you may want to engage in or you may not want to engage in. We are losing a narrative that is fun and nice and loose. And it's all very demography driven, which is fair because it is a demographic issue. We are bringing up this very serious aspect of social life, and we need to have these discussions in the academia. But the issue is that in the public discourse, as I see it, we have either a very pro-natalist strategy or a very anti-natalist strategy, meaning that children are a burden and you don't want to do that to yourself and whatnot. And as I said, we don't have that middle ground. But then again, there is another issue that I want to bring to the table because I think it's one of the crucial aspects that is not being brought up enough, which is access to reproductive services. Because we've talked about medical assisted parenthood, we mentioned sex education, we mentioned contraception a bit, but we also have to bring abortion into the table.
Yes.
And the inaccessibility of abortion in several countries has shown that banning the procedure actually leads to drops in birth rates. That's the case in Poland now. That was the case in Ceausescu's Romania in mid-60s when Decree 770 was introduced in Romania. I believe it was 1967, if I'm not mistaken, when Ceausescu, who was concerned with dropping birth rates in Romania, introduced basically a ban on abortion and contraceptives altogether. And he noted a spike in the number of births in the first years after the ban was introduced, but then there was a sudden drop. And actually, there is this brilliant research from Guttmacher's Institute, a very recent one. I think it was published last week or so, in which they mentioned that after abortion was banned in several states, reproductive health clinics, are actually observing a drastic spike in the number of people seeking long-active reversible contraceptives because they don't want to risk it. And as a researcher, I'm doing my PhD on lived abortion experiences, and I talk to many people. That's also my job. I work in a foundation. I support people who decide to terminate a pregnancy that want to access contraceptives. And I've talked to hundreds of people who told me that after the Polish Constitutional Tribunal's ban, which led to abortion being accessible in the national healthcare system only in the cases of the pregnancy being a result of the crime or it posing a threat to the pregnant person's life or health, is just too much of a risk. And so I've heard people saying, I decided to have an abortion because I didn't want to be forced into a situation where, for example, I would learn of fetal abnormalities and I would be forced to carry. And that's also the case. But it's also the fact that people want to have that choice. I vividly remember one person that I was talking to who told me, when I learned that I'm pregnant, I immediately started seeking a person who would perform a procedure illegally. And she found that doctor. And he was the first one who told her, if you want, I can help you in that pregnancy, and I promise I will not lie to you, because this is also the case in Poland. The doctors lie to their patients and fail to disclose an information about a fetal abnormality that is developing. And then you're caught off guard in a situation that is one of the most dreadful situations that you might be in. And she told me that that moment when she was informed, promised, I will not lie to you. I can help you if you want. You have that choice. I can also perform the abortion. That was the first time that she felt safe. And she decided to carry on with the abortion. She didn't have that child. But this is something that we have to bring to the table as well, that anti-abortion stances are actually hurting our demography long time.
I'm not sure necessarily, and I'm not an expert in this, and frankly, it's a conversation that makes me feel a little bit, as a man, awkward. I think it's a conversation that should be driven by women. But if you look at Japan, Japan's quite interesting because abortion rates were historically very high. When the rest of the developed world had access to the pill contraception for women, I think the 70s probably, that was around the time when birth rates fell, and many people are pointing to the pill as the reason for low birth rates. But Japan did not legalize the pill until 1990. And then they did legalize it and abortions dropped. But you don't see any change in Japanese birth rates through that transition, around 1990. So whether it's contraception or whether it's abortion, important as those topics are, no question, I'm not sure ultimately the overall impact in birth rates would be that significant. I mean, one thing I do notice very briefly, though, in terms of coercion, is Iran a few years ago banned vasectomies to try and increase its low birth rate. I mean, that's the thing I think we should be absolutely, waiting for in other countries, because I think other nations will try to do the same thing but I'm not sure, I don't believe that's the right thing to do. And I'm not sure that will even be effective.
To what extent? Yeah, please go ahead, Alaka.
No, actually, before we begin, I have things on that, but I'll let that continue with your questions. I just had a clarification I want from you, Laurie, because you're the expert on stable families and the impact on children, etc. The thing is, in a country like the US, where the divorce rate is very high,
Really high.
because divorce is easily available, what you're getting, the families that do not separate, I'm assuming, are the families that are happily married. And so, whether you would get the same advantage to marriage in parts of the world where families are not happy but cannot separate, I'm wondering whether you know anything about that. That is it always the case that the biological parents and the child is the best situation for families, or is it here we have a biased sample because the ones that remain together are the ones that are stable and happy together? So if you looked at a country, say a more conservative country where divorce is not possible, or very difficult, or socially not sanctioned, India included, it's changing, but even so, it's not so easy to get divorced. And there, I'm not sure that you'd see a big gap between the welfare of children, for example, in biologically intact families compared to separated families.
I actually have looked at this with respect to two human capital outcomes. One is children's education, and the other one is children's survival, under 5 mortality. So obviously under 5 mortality isn't a big deal in the developed world, but children whose mothers have been through a marital transition are at higher risk of child mortality. And of course, there are many different ways that you could explain that. And it could be some selection and some causation or whatever. But if you then just start talking about the benefits of stability, they show up in education, even in places where marriage is forced, if you will. Basically, across the globe, the best educational outcomes are in two-parent families, except, this is really interesting, in places where single mothers are elite themselves. Where marriage at a young age is so normal that someone who gets to be a single mother is someone who's exercising a lot of choice and has a lot of freedom within her culture because of her high socioeconomic status. To be a single mother in the United States, the stereotypical one is someone living in the inner city. But tell me what a single mother in northern India looks like. Is she poor?
There are so few single mothers.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So it's difficult. That's why I'm concerned whether it's an economic effect. I mean, is it that a stable family has more resources and so education is easier for their children,
It's
or
not
is
the
it something more?
resources, because low income married guys, at least in the United States, I think this is more places too, are more attached to the labor force than ones who don't have dependents. And so that doesn't mean that they're prosperously working for lots of money. It means that they're fulfilling a nurturing responsibility of economically providing for the family. And I'm not saying that's just a man's responsibility. I am very firmly in the camp that says that women should lean in on the economic front and that men should lean in on the home front. But motherhood changes women more than it changes men in my culture, because guys are allowed to not necessarily participate. And if there's a norm that producing a child means that you are engaged in rearing them, it's easier to produce a high quality child. And I put it in air quotes because I'm talking about human capital. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about health. So when I come across as an advocate of marriage, it's not that marriage itself should be promoted or put down anyone's throat. It's that the recipe that we're looking for, where you have children that are growing up as productive members of society, is easier when both biological parents are in the household. And having both biological parents in the household is more common with marriage than with cohabitation. I'm not saying the other options aren't there. They're just less common. They're harder.
Beyond the parents, though, I can't help but think of the old adage, it takes a village to raise a child.
Mhm.
Have we lost the village in many places, particularly in developed countries, where it is a two-person job and perhaps historically it wasn't?
Yeah. Oh, I think we have. When I was thinking through my own position, like trying to figure out how I was going to articulate marriage makes it easier to raise high quality children, I'm like, well, what else do we need? I teach at the Catholic University of America. I'm not Catholic, but there's a principle in Catholic social thought that's solidarity, where you go down. Oh, I hope I used the right word. I shouldn't be talking about Catholic social thought when I don't have the vocabulary. Anyway, you use the lowest possible the lowest possible social organization to deal with an issue. And in this case, with childlessness, it would be the family. But I'm like, can't we be more creative than that? And it made me think about work on communities. And darn it, anyway, his name is escaping me right now. Stephen. Oh, it'll come back. But anyway, I sent a message to someone that Brandon Vaidyanathan, the chair in sociology at Catholic, had introduced me to, who was into building neighborhoods. So Seth Kaplan's work talks about neighborhoods as a unit to help support childbearing. And when he spoke at our campus, he had this anecdote that just stuck in my mind because it was so beautiful. So the kid fell down and was bleeding in the front yard, and his wife scooped up the child and ran down the block. He had no clue where she was going. And she took her child to the nearest nurse's house, whom she knew could deal with the bleeding injury, the one that I would have called 911 for, to have an ambulance come so that at least the kid was being taken care of on the ambulance ride the way they wouldn't while I was driving. This woman just ran down the block to someone she knew. I don't know what my neighbors do. I don't know where the nearest nurse is. I don't know if she'd be home or he'd be home when I got there. If you have a neighborhood where you have that kind of neighborliness, that you know about each other's lives, you can support each other in much more important childbearing things than a single wound. There's a lot more to childbearing than just keeping our kids alive. And yeah, I would go up a level from the family as well. I love families. I think we could do a heck of a lot more with neighborhoods. Places in the world where neighborhoods have deteriorated less look better to me than the United States. And then I do think there's a place for government in shaping policy to make family easier.
Stephen?
What can governments realistically do? Well, we have a huge amount of data from multiple countries on what does not work. Giving people cash in their pockets to have children does not work. That shouldn't be surprising. This is a big life-changing decision. Opening more kindergartens does not work, good as that may be. Greater parental leave does not work. all the things, doing housework in the home, men doing more at home, does not work because we have so many examples from countries around the world. And when you look at a country to say, we'll look at Scandinavia, it's got this great policy, but then it's got a very low birth rate. Then you look at, education is a great one, actually. So many people in Japan, where education is very expensive, blame the cost of education for low birth rates.
Yes.
But in Germany, education is free, I believe, including through university, in effect. And it has effectively the same birth rate. So we know a lot of things that do not work. So what might work? For me, the evidence, the only evidence really I can see, comes from Hungary, which over 10 to 15 years has had extensive family support policies. And some people might not like all the policies of Hungary. I'm not here to defend Hungary as a nation. I work with the former president, Katalin Novak. We created a non-profit, XY Worldwide, to focus on awareness of younger people. What Hungary managed to do was enable younger people, under 25s in the data, to start families when they weren't doing that before, through giving them access to housing, forgiving student loans for women who had a child before age 30, paying their parents, the grandparents, to be carers if they wanted to be, offering larger loans for larger cars, vehicles, if they wanted 3 or more children. So there are certain things that governments can do. And I would say about Hungary, because I think this is an important point. When I first went there, probably I was under the impression that it might be a coercive country. You hear a lot of things about Hungary. And when it came to family, I went to the first conference, and there was so much discussion about single mothers and the support for single mothers in Hungary, support for the elderly. They had a community discussion about how to bring community together. I felt no coercion there, but I felt one thing. Do you know what? If I were a young person in Hungary thinking of starting a family, I would probably feel that this country supports me.
Yes.
That even if there's a divorce or something goes wrong, this country cares about family. The role of government is beyond policy and more about simply encouraging those who want to have children to do so, and equally encouraging society to understand that not everybody does.
Has it worked for Hungary, though? I'm not clear about your answer.
Yes. If you look at Hungary, it's worked in one way, but it's not enough. If you look at the age of births in Hungary, there is a bubble, a significant but small bubble of younger people starting families that we really haven't seen anywhere else. That's still there. Now, the total birth rate has come down, and some people are criticizing Hungary now, saying, oh, the policies didn't work. Well, what happened, of course, 10 years ago, younger people started having children that they weren't going to have, whilst at the same time, the 30-plus-year-olds continued to have children. So you got this double boost for around 10 years, and now it's settling down again. So I don't look at that as a failure. Hungary hasn't found a solution. I'm not saying that, but there is evidence that a broad brush approach of general supportive policies. And the interesting thing when you go to Hungary is most people on the street or in their homes where I've been don't know about these policies. It's not like they're being pushed on people's throats, have children. It's just when you get to the point of considering it, you're informed, oh, we can do all of these other things to support you.
I've also looked at Hungary, not in depth, but one of the things that I think it's too early to evaluate the policy, even though it's been quite some time. But there were a couple of things that impressed me. I'm like, okay, well, if there is coercion here, it might show up in a higher teenage birth rate. And because some of these were marriage promotion policies too, that it might show up in a higher divorce rate. And at least the early data didn't show those, that the pro-natalism and the pro-marriageism, if you will, had not had the backlash that we could legitimately fear from it. The one thing that I found in the Hungarian policy that made me very uncomfortable was the closedness to immigration. We need to have people like us to carry on the Hungarian culture. Culture's wonderful. It should be carried on. I am so aware of how pronatalism has had bedfellows who are racist and has had bedfellows that are sexist. And I don't want to be labeled with that, but it's more than that. It's not just about me. It's not just about how I come across. It's if we think that children are good, We need to find a way to promote children without being racist and without being sexist, because otherwise people are going to be just like, oh, well, if they're pro-children, they have nefarious intent. They want to take away women's rights and just forget them.
Because there is that one additional component, except from sexism and racism, which are definitely there is also fundamentalism
And classism.
and classism. And so
All the isms.
in the case of Hungary, I would be extremely cautious. I have Hungarian friends and colleagues who work with human rights, and I would say that it's a slight oversimplification to say that they introduced these policies, and so we have a slight growth, but it may not be enough. Well, Hungary is not the best with human rights, to put it politely, and there is a whole area of social life that is not reflected in pro-natalist policies that may still lead people to not want to have children, like the exclusion of migrant rights.
Stephen, does that make your work more challenging, that there is this dark underbelly of the debate where you do have white supremacists and certain corners of the far right that are citing great replacement theory, and they're afraid of, certain cultures outnumbering, certain colors outnumbering
I've had to develop very thick skin for
themselves?
sure. I've had to be cautious about what conferences I go to, about the conversations I have, and I think I've surprised some people by. I describe myself as a pan-natalist, which it's my term, so I get to define it. It means supporting those people who want to have the children they want to have, but equally supporting those who don't want children not to have children they don't have. And I think that's the good middle place we should all be. I mean, if I could share with you one piece of information, again, most people don't know from my own research, which was just published in Nature Portfolio, that the average mother in almost all of the countries we're discussing here, the average mother is having the same number of children as decades ago. So let's go back to Japan. The average mother, not woman, the average mother in Japan was having 2.2 children in 1970. They still are today. In the UK, the average mother was having around 2.3 children in 1970. Still are today. In the US, in the 1980s, the average mother was having 2.4 children. It's up to 2.6. Motherhood, and by definition, fatherhood, is therefore incredibly resilient across 5 or more decades. Huge changes in popular culture, in terms of women's rights, in terms of women's education, certainly in terms of the political environments, in terms of financial crises. Throughout it, parents keep having the same number of children once you've had that first child. The only thing that's changed is this sudden rise in childlessness, and that's significant too. So we're not talking about a drifting into higher levels of childlessness, and I will bring it back to government in a moment. What we're seeing is a series of shocks to parenthood. In Japan and Italy and many European countries, it was 1974, literally in the aftermath of the oil shock, which I'm just old enough to remember. In the US, there was a small increase in childlessness, but a sudden one in 71 when certain things economically were happening in the US. And then on a much more global basis, 08, 09, right after the global mortgage crisis, we find this huge increase in delayed parenthood. But again, no change in the average family size. So for me, it's clear that this is not a sudden increase in voluntary childlessness. Just suddenly overnight, suddenly people don't want children. And I would back that up further from my paper showing that in Japan in 74, it wasn't just the large metropolitan areas that saw this increase. It was the rural areas. It was the Okinawa Islands, the whole country. If you did not have that first child, people were delaying parenthood. And then that never recovers. So for me, if we're looking at government policy, to bring it back, it's not actually about supporting existing parents, although that's probably a good thing to do. We probably want to do that. But in terms of addressing this issue, it's how can we increase pathways into parenthood for those who want it? And I'd love to bring it back to a point about, you talked about marriage, you talked about, we've talked about men. I think we're talking about men kind of needing parenthood more, and I mentioned maybe in their 20s that men these days are maybe more frustrated and finding channels other than traditional education career pathways in life. If you're a young person today, 18, 20, 22, and you've got your first boyfriend, girlfriend, say, you're probably not thinking that person's going to be the mother of your children or father of your children, because that's probably 8 to 10 years away. So the framing of relationships at a younger age today, I suspect, is different from when it was, and when it certainly still is in other countries, a case of this person actually might be the person I end up starting a family with and spending life with together.
Are you
Not,
talking about the Western world? Is that what you're
well,
talking
it
about?
certainly adds Japan to
Or
that.
certain...
There are many cultures
Mhm.
right now, and I suspect it's happening in Latin America, many others too. So just on that point,
Mhm.
I think this whole idea of delayed parenthood and what happened from these shocks economically, delaying that first child, creates an environment where people are just not taking early relationships particularly seriously, because there's no need to, because we're not telling young people that the likelihood of becoming a parent in our 30s is much lower than people expect. And I think that goes part of the problem here that governments can start to address, awareness of just the reality of data.
Alaka?
Again, I keep coming to this from my experience of the debates around high fertility, where again it was we kept telling young people that you're too young to be getting into a partnership, a serious partnership, and having a child. You must postpone. And we had the WHO telling them how teen pregnancies were bad for the mother, they were bad for the child, they were bad for family stability, they were bad for everything. And now we are saying that no, we should get young people at the of 19 and 20 to think that, oh, not he's not bad, he might make a good father. That's It's very funny that it just shows that our ideology or our policy preferences are deciding our ideologies about what is good or what is bad. So I'm getting that's one point that I think I want to make, that and about this early childbearing. And the other thing is about the childlessness. As it's true, when you have a TFR, a fertility rate of say zero point 0.8, it doesn't mean that every woman is having zero point 0.8 children. It does mean that those who have one typically have two. We are getting more heterogeneity in the population. You have one set of women who are having 2 or 3 children, and you have another set of women who are having 0 children. And so that second group is increasing. So it's true that once you become a mother, you are having the same number of children that you did 50 years ago or 40 years ago. But a larger proportion of women are not getting there at all, are not beginning motherhood. And that's what's bringing down the
Yes.
average. And if they're not beginning motherhood, who are we to say it's only because they're delaying it, as opposed to they do have a different set of ideologies and values in their head now and have decided that motherhood is not for them. So there is two kinds of women. I remember there was a very interesting research in France. I remember among the this was in PDR several years ago, a paper about how you really already at that stage you had the traditionalists, the women who continued to have 2 and 3 children, and then you had a large number who had 1 or 0, and they were very different in their motivations, in their aspirations. They were two different populations, almost two different species. And I think that's what's happening now as well. And so I don't think it's a question of just delaying and therefore not. Then you're bringing up the question of involuntary childlessness.
Yes,
I don't think it's that. I think there is a
it
large
is.
number of women, an increasing number of women who have decided that motherhood is not for them, and the women who want motherhood are in fact not interested in stopping at one, and so it's true that they end up with two, which is what mothers ended up with in the
Yeah,
past.
the data, unfortunately, just respectfully doesn't support that. So if you take the National Family Growth Surveys in the US, consistently 90 to 95% of women over recent decades have or want children in their fertile years, around age 30. In the UK, a similar survey 2 years ago showed that 92% of British women either have or want children. And those numbers haven't changed all. They have come down a little, but not all that much. But if you look at the current fertility pattern in the US, the same data that's used to produce the TFR, you would find that if current fertility patterns in the US remain the same, only 60% of women in the US will become mothers. 8% want to be childless, 40% are going to be childless. We have a massive crisis of unplanned childlessness. And that alone is driving birth rates around the world. We see it in Japan, we see it in Europe, and I'm quite sure it's unraveling in southern India, in Latin America as well right now.
What about the men? What does data say about men wanting to become parents?
Yes, it's a great question. And again, I'm embarrassed that we have so little data on men, but the data we have indicates that men have a slight less desire to become a father, or less bothered if they don't. You're right to say that there's more childless men than childless women, because some men get to marry twice or have children with two families, leaving others who want children to miss out. But if I could just share from the Birth Gap documentary a scene where I interview men, I mean, almost in tears. Many women were in tears. People who are grieving, that's the word they use, grieving the families that they don't have. Now, this is a hidden crisis. People who are grieving childlessness aren't doing it on the streets. They're not coming into talk shows like this. They're doing it in the privacy of their homes. They're rarely forming campaign groups, so there are support groups online. So the idea that this is a trivial thing for those people, not all who want children necessarily, but a significant minority, if not indeed majority of people who want children, that it's a lifelong grieving episode, really needs to be brought into the public debate.
And it needs to be brought up, I believe, that it is painful for some people to miss on that opportunity to have children. But we also have to remember, and I don't mean to say to sound anti-natalist right now, but that's something that I wanted to mention when Laurie, you mentioned that one thing that I possibly misheard earlier, but that we tend to go into these binaries, as I mentioned earlier, right? That we say, yes, people are grieving not having children, but some people are grieving having children. Some people miss the life that they had. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't give the voice to both sides. But what is dangerous, in my opinion, is that the pro-natalist movement, while, again, it is important to bring up the fact that some people may regret that decision, just like some people may regret having children, is strongly tied to, honestly, very dangerous movements. And we are seeing it all over Europe. There was actually a brilliant journalist investigation conducted in Poland by a group of journalists that proves that the pro-natalist narratives are often sponsored by the Kremlin, which is very interesting. And we have a network of organizations. In Poland, there is one, for example, that is training other Christian fundamentalists and basically sending them out, opening their own foundation cells in different countries, and then exchanging ideas and strategies. And when you look into it, there are documents about it. There are reports about it. I strongly recommend a read from Neil Datta, who's a brilliant researcher from the European Parliament, who talks about how these pro-natalist strategies are often tied to very big money and a very specific worldview. There is the 5 main goals that were publicized on several websites, actually, that the goals are to ban contraception, to ban abortion, to ban sex ed, to ban divorce, and to ban IVF. And it's out there. So while I agree, I strongly oppose the dominating of public narrative because it just opens the door to a group of people, a group of interests, actually, that I find personally strongly harmful and possibly dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, there are fringes, perhaps, to every argument, and certainly in this one, there are fringes in the past. Paula Ehrlich and the population growth story that still he supports. He's still alive, still telling us the same thing he was telling us in 1968 when his book The Population Bomb came out. And so that's a fringe because he won't update his worldview. And we have fringes on the other side too. I think both are counterproductive because all you've got to do in both cases is look at data. Parents are having the same number of children as decades ago. So the idea that pro-natalist groups are going to encourage people to make a decision to have a larger family is probably not realistic from the data. Equally, it's the case that the vast majority of childless people in those countries that have had low birth rates for many decades, they did want children one day. So we don't have much persuading. We don't need pro-natalist groups to be preaching about this, if that's the right term. Maybe it is.
There are some governments that are trying to actually encourage childbirth by conferring status on motherhood. What are your thoughts on that policy? I'd love to get from you as well, Alaka.
Yeah, I'm not sure of specific countries, but I would say this. I do hear from a significant number of women that motherhood's no longer valued. So maybe we do need to increase the status, not to necessarily inflate it beyond where it should be, which I think is high. I think we've done a pretty poor job at respecting the work that mothers do in the home, and often at the same time having a part-time or full-time job or career to support the family. So in some ways, I'm not totally against the idea of promoting the status of motherhood
And fatherhood.
and fatherhood. Yeah.
Alaka, Russia. By the way, Russia gives medals to
Yeah,
mothers, so
and
that
this
was
was
kind of what I was
actually,
referring to as
we've
well.
heard about it in Nazi Germany. We've seen it in Italy, where you were, I don't know what they were called, women who had 9 and 10 children were honored and given all kinds of prizes and incentives. The thing is, that all these policies, at one level, you can call them incentives to bear children, but the line between incentives and disincentives is very porous. I mean, you're making, it's very difficult to say that a particular policy is helping women have children versus it's hindering their ability not to have children. And the contraception and abortion controls, for example, can very easily become an easier default option than giving supporting services in childcare and other kinds of things that they want. So, to me, the the best policy really is should not be consciously pro-natalist, but for the sake of women and for the sake of women who want children, of course, we need a policy structure that is supportive. That in any case, women who have children deserve to have childcare options, deserve to have healthcare options, deserve to have free schooling, regardless of how many of them want children and whether they'll have more children or less children as a result of it. These are basic rights that a rich country should be providing anyway. And I think that's the way to look at it instead of, and so the rise, perhaps there'll be a rise in birth rates, perhaps they won't. It should, that's an independent question. That should not motivate the policies that we have. And I think that's an important point to make. And it appears that policies that are holistic and generally in favor of gender equality and helping women manage work and the home, things like that, are do end up incidentally, maybe might are more likely to end up, shouldn't say do, are more likely to end up having an impact on birth rates. But that cannot be the motivation, just like in the past when it was antinatalist policies had to really focus on the fact that women were having children because they had so few options in old age, etc. That the old age security was an important, should have been an important part of policy, whether or not it led to fewer births. That's the point I want to make. I think that's very important. And I think those are, even if they're not, if at least if they're not consciously stated as natalist or anti-natalist, they might end up having impacts that are much more long term than these piecemeal measures of giving money for each additional child, etc. That's one thing. But I had a second question for you because you worked with men. You're one of the few people who can talk about who's talked to men. These men who are grieving, that what's the reason for being childless?
Yeah, well, it
Usually.
ranges. In the documentary, I show 3 or 4 men. One had not met his life partner. He came from academia and had fully expected, as an educated person, to find that right person. It never happened. The second gave up on IVF after 20 years of trying. A third married someone with children, and at the time thought that was okay. And then he realized the more time he spent with her children, the more he needed his own children. And there's various other off-camera ones I've had. These were actually, to me, and I've talked to hundreds of people. I filmed in 24 countries and continue to talk to many people about this. Probably the most difficult conversations I have had are with men, not all men, but some men who want a family, breaking down, just not knowing what went wrong, just being led into this life of focus on your career, maybe play around, take your time, there's no rush. And I've got some contacts who, childless men who turn 40 and just suddenly, why am I finding it hard to get dates now? All that happened is I'm 1 year older. So I think women have got this, desire to find a certain profile of man, and it's not an older man. So all of this actually, I think we can agree on a lot here. I believe we can. Certainly there should not be coercion of people to have children. I don't think increasing family size or coercion to do that, or persuasion, incentive to larger family size is going to work, because the data shows for decades people are having the same number of children once they have the first child. If we focus on policies that decrease unplanned childlessness, but also, sure, decrease unintended parenthood, which I think is smaller, but I'll not defend that overly. I think the reality is that across European countries, Far Eastern countries, the US, Canada, Australia, and beyond, we're heading now for 40% childlessness. Korea is already over that. A Korean child born today has a 45% chance of ever becoming a parent. And, if we focus on why that is and try to solve that problem, it's not really, therefore, best to think of this as even a birth rate crisis. So I agree with you that we shouldn't have policies to address, birth rates per se. All we need to do is be caring about people in this society and recognize that a significant number of people are not having the children they want to have.
With the men that you spoke with, was there anyone who were just having infertility issues? Are there any environmental reasons where
Yeah,
maybe perhaps
yeah.
lower sperm count?
Yeah. And, so this comes up a lot. And yes, I have met men like this. And, in the documentary, I interviewed 4 fertility doctors around the world. So just quoting them, I'm not an expert. For male infertility issues, it's easier to find solutions, I guess, to find the sperm, to remove it, and to use IVF. So that becomes less of an issue, although it is an increasing factor. When it comes to falling birth counts around the world, I'm not an expert biologically in that, of course, but you would not expect falling birth rates you would not expect falling sperm counts to be an issue in Japan in 1974 suddenly, and Italy, but not the US, not the UK, and not France. And you wouldn't expect in 2009 suddenly, after the mortgage crisis, it was a deterioration of sperm quality that caused this current crisis. What may be true is that if we start to solve this unplanned childlessness crisis, as people perhaps start having more children younger, that there might be another ceiling that we haven't seen in reality yet in the data, which may be a biological health issue that we have to confront. So I'm not saying it's not there, but I am saying that there's just a deeper reality that's causing what we see around the world today.
Laurie?
Yeah. What's happening to me is what's happening to you, where it's like, oh, there are all these things I'm
So
trying to
many
keep
things
track
to
of.
address.
You can get to all the things.
But let me just go ahead and respond to the soulmates part, because the first person you mentioned was someone who hadn't found his soulmate yet. And I'd like to call that out as an ideology that is destructive in terms of partnering and parenthood. That if you believe that there's a soulmate out there for you and you have to find that person, you're not going to deal with real people in the same way. And this one is one that crosses socioeconomic strata. In some of Catherine Eden's work with her husband, Timothy Nelson, she talks about unwed single fathers who weren't necessarily marrying their baby mamas. And part of it was that they were a little bit afraid they might meet their soulmate after they did, and then they'd have to get a divorce. And I'm not saying that was the only thing that was going on, but it's like the idea that I have to maximize that there's something out there, and particularly something that I believe is fictitious, that there's one person that was created for me. I'm not sure where that came from, but it's latched on.
I believe we can blame Plato for that, actually.
Oh, can we go back that
Yeah.
far?
I
Really?
think so, yeah.
Okay, well, I will go back that far.
Well,
How come
half
it's gotten
exists somewhere.
Yeah,
how
have,
come
Yeah,
it's
have
gotten
yeah.
so popular more
Does anyone
recently?
believe in
Actually,
soulmates
like,
at this
well-
table? I'm curious.
Again,
Certainly
sorry?
not at this age. We've discovered why it doesn't. There's
Well-
no such thing.
So if you look at...
1 second. I think
Sure.
you wanted to get a point
Yeah.
in.
Yeah, about Laurie,
Antonina.
about you asking how did it happen? How
Yeah.
did we get to that point? Actually, I think that when you look at how romantic life had been organized in the past, it's different. I even remember showing this graph to my students because it evolved. At some point in history, marriage wasn't about love.
Oh,
For a
of course not.
majority of
Yeah.
history, marriage wasn't about love. It was
Yeah.
about having a duty to have
Mhm.
children, specifically boys, to kind of pay back to the society, give back because you were expected to do so. You're expected to carry on with the lineage. And then when you look into how that romantic outlines, blueprints, let's call them, evolved, then you can see that we started focusing on finding this perfect person. And also, it is very visible, actually, when you look at biography studies, that that notion of having a possible soulmate uh, hurts us on a very deep level in many ways. And one of them is that constant explanation to oneself that I cannot leave because this is my person. That's the one that I should stay with, no matter what, regardless of goodness, the abuse that one may be suffering, regardless of a situation that just isn't working out, regardless of the fact that you may know that this person isn't going to be a fit parent, not going to be a parent that you want for your child. And so that idea of soulmates is actually hurtful, despite being very sugary on the outside. It's nice. We like it. It's like a snack that we
I'm
can
so
have. It's so
fascinated by what you're
nice.
saying, because
But when you look at it historically, we had institutions, and now love became another goal to obtain. It's been commodified. And actually, when you look at this brilliant Polish philosopher, Bauman, he became known in the mid 20th century and on. He was in the UK later on in his life. He emigrated from Poland, but he mentioned in one of his last interviews that when you look at love, it's been commodified in a very capitalist way because we aren't meeting people and talking to them anymore. We look at produce. We look at, we just swipe on Tinder left or right. It's about choosing something like you're choosing grocery on a shelf
and maximizing.
and maximizing. So it's again about that growth and about that very philosophy behind how we think about life and society. And that brings me back to ethics of care, which is that feminist notion that we should start rewarding care, which is majorly unpaid labor, which is not recognized, which is not appreciated. Stephen, you mentioned the lack of appreciation of motherhood. Totally agree. We are not seeing mothers. I don't know if it's the case in your countries, but for example, in Poland, we are having a quite heated discussion about child-free spaces, like child-free cafes that are being opened that you cannot bring your child into because it's for people that don't want to hear the child screaming or crying or whatnot. And it's a discussion. Some people say, well, I have a preference. I don't want a child running around when I'm typing on my laptop or working. And there are people who say, okay, but where are the spaces for parents then? Where are the spaces for children? Why are we alienating children? And it's a valid discussion that we need to have, I believe. But when we make love and relationships and soulmates into a project that leads to a number of issues that also, I believe, contribute to that drop in birth rates. And if we take that philosophical stance of recognizing care, unpaid labor, and welcoming people into the society rather than excluding them from it, that could be a mix that could be beneficial for social life. But then again, I want to stress, and I will not stop stressing that, you can be a beneficial member of society. You can give to others without becoming a parent, right?
Of course. I think
So
everyone at the
let's
table
just
agrees
stress
with
that
that.
because
Sure.
I really want it to be out there that this discussion is about you needing to have children and that we can be amazing people without becoming parents. So it's mostly about a major discussion about what's going to happen then and about how we reshape our approach to social life and therefore to economy and therefore to production and therefore to consumption.
But I have to ask you, and I want to get to Stephen and Laurie, but what are you suggesting as an alternative approach to viewing relationships? Because you were saying in the past, it wasn't commodified. In the past, it wasn't about finding your one true love. Are you saying to go
it was
back to
marriage that was
that?
commodified.
Or what are you saying? What's the alternative
It was
to the
marriage that was
soulmate
commodified,
narrative?
not love.
Sure.
So I'm absolutely not saying, let's be clear, I'm not saying we have to go back to that. Absolutely not. I am very happy with the place that we are in right now, with the possibility to leave if you want to, with the possibility to find the partner that you want to find rather than be set up with someone that your family chooses, for example, which I believe is still an issue in many countries in the world. But then again, I blame capitalism. I blame capitalism for a number of issues that are affecting birth rates and choices about parenthood, about how we shape our life. The fact that that notion of constant growth and racing towards and actually unidentified, undefined idea of growth and perfection, it's unobtainable. We are never going to, end up in the place that we think we should end up, because the capitalist idea is we have to go forward constantly. There is a saying in Polish that it's not about catching a rabbit, but about following the rabbit. It's about the run. So we keep running to catch the rabbit, but there is no rabbit to catch. And I think that's the issue. And the discussion that we've been having, actually, if we engage this idea to look into it from a Marxist perspective for a minute, you can say that we are talking about creating more workforce, because it is what it is. We are talking
I've
about
basically said that.
yeah, it's that the discussion that we are having is about we need to have more children because we need more workforce,
Yes.
which implies a very specific role of an individual in a society, right? And so, yeah, I'm not afraid to say I blame capitalism.
Yeah, the whole point of development, I thought, was supposed to be that you would free people from work, from this constant, constant need to be a part of the labor force. I mean, I remember Bertrand Russell and all talking about 4 week days, 4 day weeks, and 6 hour a day work day. So the whole point was that you don't keep chasing for more, for more. The point is that you once you've reached the level of consumption that the Western world has, we really need to be thinking both about scaling back and about scaling back by letting people do other things. And it's now become, you feel guilty. This Christian work ethic, I think, has gone too far. It's become a situation where it's right. We're thinking in economist terms about dependency ratios and labor force sizes and participation, etc. But an important part of that discussion is about how do we get an annual GDP growing even faster, and that should not be the aim. So the aim, I think, right now, if we are talking about low birth rates, at one level, one can talk about policies to increase births, either through gentle persuasion or through more support. But on the other hand, we also need to talk about how we adapt to fewer births. And that, I think, we are not doing enough about. So one of them is the degrowth that we're talking about. But there are other things also we can think of. I'm thinking, I mean, again, it's an economist language, but retirement ages, for example, is something that's brought up, that people are living longer and living healthier and productive longer. So maybe we can uh, think about working at that end. And we all, as a demographer, again, as a trained demographer, we know that population has three arms. We know there's births, there's deaths, and there's migration. So so we can't. On the one, we are working on deaths. That is easy to work on because we know everyone wants to live forever. But births are more complicated. Migration, of course, is highly politicized. But there are many other things one can think of. Retirement age is, I was thinking of, as one thing. But I was just reading the other day about maybe we should lower the retirement age. If you want pronatalism, if you lower the retirement age, grandparents can become caregivers for their grandchildren, and that might incentivize parents to have children too. But I am a grandmother, and I can say that when I've spent half a day with two little kids, I'm waiting to pack them off and send them away. So it's not so easy. But as a serious matter, really, we are not talking about what the adaptation policy should be. And we do need to talk about that, especially when we all agree that overconsumption is destroying the environment, it's destroying the planet, and which should then bring us back circularly to why should we bring children into the kind of world that we are creating?
Yeah, and
So
There's a
I
lot
have
to
to get
unpack.
Stephen in, and then I'll let you respond. Okay.
There's a lot to unpack, but I'd like to go back to, well, soulmates and what might be called pair bonding, how you find that partner to start a family with. That's a big decision for anyone. And if you, again, dive down into data for 39 economies with no exceptions, going back decades, you find this curve, this peak age that mothers are having children, fathers too, for the countries we have father data, same curve, just a little delayed. The biggest shock I got as a data scientist in my life was when I looked at that curve for recent years. I had assumed that this curve, would start at a younger age, but people would be deferring parenthood. There'd be a peak maybe around 30 when people got established career-wise, maybe another peak 35, and certainly a peak from IVF. There's no peaks. There's no skews of significance. And what it means if you look at this, or rather looking at this curve, which undermines, we're looking at data for developed wealthier nations now, but also data for Central Europe going back to the 60s or even 50s, I believe. So there's a range of economies that this encompasses. And one thing's exceptionally clear, and I'm going to be bold and say we'd be foolish to ignore it, that when people were having children at younger age, the peak of that curve was much higher. Much higher. Now the curve's still there, but it has become stretched. And mathematically, as it stretches, the total area under curve, the total parenthood predictably declines. And why am I mentioning that in relation to pair bonding? Well, it seems to be, because this models almost perfectly, R squared at 98%, it's phenomenal. When people in a society think they only have a short time to find that perfect partner because everybody else is finding a partner, there's more rush. And I think more desire either to make a compromise or to tell yourself, oh, that's my soulmate, when otherwise you might have felt, no, I'll wait longer. So I think the process of finding that partner has become so stretched that finding another person who's on the same page as you at the same time and whose life is engineered like yours, who likes taking the same kind of vacations, who wants to live in the same city, who has the same dreams for future, it simply makes it more complicated and ultimately is driving low birth rates. And if that's true, here's the conundrum. I believe that we will not solve this crisis unless the age of parenthood becomes significantly younger. I'm not saying that from an ideological point of view at all. I'm just looking at data, saying that actually to get that peak, when we get 80 to 90% of people having children again, and we know that motherhood kind of is locked in, people are not having more or less children than they were decades ago. For this to work out in any sense, parenthood needs to become younger, and it might not. It might not because people don't want to become children younger. And societies are not engineered, so it might not. And that means long-term degrowth. But also it means that if we as societies even wanted to become parent at a younger age, how do you do that? Because there's no bimodal peak. You would have to, like Hungary, create this bubble of younger people having children at the same time as older people at the same time. And Hungary had some success at doing that, but it's only a small bubble. Effectively, stretching the time of parenthood is easy because time flows forward. Delaying a year or two for a society is easy. People just work longer or study longer. But reversing that, I think, is going to be the real crunch, and I'm not sure we're going to survive it. This is a survival crunch. This is existential.
Yeah, existential. But not everybody agrees at the table that it is.
Yeah,
So
I would like to see these these young parents 10 or 15 years from now. I want to know, whether they did a good thing or not, didn't do a good thing from the point of view of their children's lives, from the point of view of their own lives, their own marital stability, getting married at an early age and having a child at an early age, this bubble that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's too soon to know. It might have raised births for a short while,
I agree.
but it's too soon to know whether that's something that is socially desirable. We'll only know that 20 years from now. All this time we were being told that that's not a good thing, that early marriage and early childbearing, and not just from the health point of view, but from the intellectual maturity point of view. So it's not a question of soulmates alone. It's a question of many other things. Of how mature are you to be making these life-changing decisions at the age of 19 and 20?
Can I make a quick point?
Yes, and then Antonina, I'll get you in.
If you, I've surveyed women in the US. I suspect it's same in most places about what age they think a woman without children has a 50% chance of becoming a mother, not through biology, but through actually what's happening in society, age of motherhood. And 85% said between age 35 and 40. In all countries I've looked at, that age is 30 or under. So there's a huge awareness gap. People think they've got more time. They think it's okay. I don't need to take this boyfriend, girlfriend seriously, or I don't need to even think of a relationship now because there's so much time to be had. I think, well, I've directly seen young people change their minds after looking at my documentary, because that number shocks a lot of people. In all countries I've researched, no more than half of women without children becoming mothers after age 30. It's shocking, frightening to a lot of young women who are thinking, wait a minute, you told me to get an education, you told me to establish my career. Why haven't you been telling us as societies that actually I've only a 50% chance after the age of 30?
Antonina?
I keep wondering because I'm not a data scientist. I don't deal with demographics daily like you do, but I keep going back to that fact that I hope I remember it correctly. But I believe the median age for a woman in Europe to have a first child is around 29 right now. So that means that if it's a medium, that means that we have a significant number of women that are actually older when they have their first child. And I wonder how that plays with what you're mentioning, Stephen.
Oh, it's because there's a huge number of childless women. So when you look at the median at that age, people are just not having children at all. It falls off very quickly right after that.
Okay. Yeah, so just that was just a clarification question. And I wanted actually to build on what Alaka said, which was, I have to check my notes because I don't remember even anymore. Okay. Which is kind of connected to Soraya. I remember that I didn't actually answer your question about what I believe should be the shape of love and relationships now. And listening to you, Alika, about how we shape and create parenthood and communities, that's something that I believe we should focus on, because capitalism is to blame for a huge number of issues that we're facing today. And if we go back to the communities, to villages, because we also had a question about, did we lose the village? I believe we did. We lost that moment of getting to know each other and having fun with that, because we can scroll their Facebook and their Instagram and read something that they commented on a post several years ago, and we have this feeling that we know them and they're not interesting, which may be the case, but
it also may not.
It also may not. So I think we should somehow figure out a way of going back to being a community, of being supportive, of getting to know friends of my friends, or maybe a personal, but I believe quite funny story, that my partner is actually a son of my mom's best friend from university, and they reconnected years later, and then we met and it just clicked. And without having these connections, and there are so many people that migrate either internally in a country or externally, and they don't have their families and they don't have loved ones, and capitalism is forcing us to work 10, 12 hours a day, and we simply don't have the time. And even if we manage to, scratch out these 3-4 hours, we are exhausted. And the majority of people would rather just stay in and lay in bed and maybe watch Netflix or just rest, because we don't have the capacity to engage in social life. And that is something that's hurting us all, including the birth rate. I remember looking at data about months and births in specific months in the year. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, demographers, but I believe that the majority of children for a very long time were actually born in early autumn, which means that they were conceived in the winter.
Yes.
Why was it winter? Because people were sitting at home together. It was cold. They couldn't really go to the park. They were forced to spend time together, and they had fun because they had the time to indulge in it. Because Laurie, it really resonated with me when you said that we lost the fun of parenthood. We lost the fun of life. We have to deliver. We have to provide. We have to build. We have to work. And constant echo that's always somewhere in the back of your mind, that I cannot go to the cinema, I cannot go meet my girlfriends, I don't have the time, I have to work to create, to gain, and to rush on. And we lost that pause. So I believe that a solution to that crisis would be to go back to the beginnings, go back to creating communities. Maybe 15-minute cities would be some kind of solution. Maybe donut economy is something that we should look into more closely. Maybe economy of well-being is something that we should focus on. I believe New Zealand had an attempt to drop GDP and introduce mental well-being factor that they would track their economy with. I think that failed, but that's a good thing. Not for New Zealand, not for Zealanders, but it's a good thing because we were learning. And many people at this table have said that we have to look at others, we have to learn from them. And there was a failed attempt. Well, that's not great, but also it is great because we got feedback. We know what didn't work, but let's keep trying. Just because we failed once doesn't mean that we cannot try again. And if we are to solve a number of issues, we have to reshape our approach towards capitalism itself, because we are overworked, we are overstressed, it impacts our quality of life, it impacts our health. And so many issues regarding fertility are also related to health, both mental and physical. So I see no other way.
Laurie, I'm
The
curious to get
UN
your
is the UN is just set up a commission on redefining GDP, which they want to now have indices that go beyond per capita income and what kinds of measures. My husband is a part of it, so I keep listening when he's on the call about the things that need to be included. I mean, like Bhutan has its own happiness index, and so similarly, that I think free time must be an integral part of any developmental measure. That if you call yourself a developed country, you should be not calling yourself that on the basis of how many hours of work you do, but how many hours of work you can do how many hours of work you don't do. Time to be free is what you expected would increase with development, and the opposite seems to have happened. We feel guilty to be free. I know that when I read a novel, I feel guilty enough to, in fact, place it inside an academic book and then read. So
Sorry.
it is if I'm doing that at work in my office, I feel I should only read a novel in bed at night. If I'm reading in my office, I should keep some other demography journal under it. So, but I do think that we need to rethink, and then a lot of these issues, if we recast the meaning of development and move beyond economic growth, especially economic growth that is so harmful to the environment, and that itself, I believe, in surveys show that women who want to be childless or child-free, whatever you want to call it, a part of it is actually concerned about bringing children into the kind of world we have created, whether it's a physical world or the ideological world or the violence-filled world. I mean, I really fear for my children who are now grown up, but even now I keep thinking that when I'm dead and I'm not there to protect them, what will happen is such an uncertain, unpredictable world. And with young children, it's even worse. I mean, when you think, so you can be genuinely altruistic from the point of view of the next generation by not wanting children. So I mean, so I think there are so many reasons for not having children. So this 2 children is in an ideal world, but as you face the unpredictability and the tensions of the current world, many people want to step back and think that, do I want to bring a child into this, and do I want to leave a child to fend for himself in this kind of world once I'm gone?
Especially before building our own base, right? Because
Yes.
Stephen, you keep going back to the age issue, that we have to de-age the population that's having children.
Yes.
But how are we going to do it if the young people's life are so unstable in
Yes.
so many different
Yeah.
areas? Like, we have the
Huge.
housing crisis, we have issues with the job market, we've got lack of accessibility of healthcare, we've got issues with education, and maybe individually these wouldn't add up that much to the declining birth rates. But if we bring them all together and look at it holistically, it's a terrible situation to have children, let's be honest. The fact that I want to have children is seen by my friends as some form of privilege. because I
Yes.
have the possibility to even think about that.
Lori?
Well, just as a side note, it was really fun to hear you as someone who's put herself forward as, an abortion rights advocate, to be talking about how we need traditional communities, because none of the four of us fit in the pigeonholes of liberal and conservative. You sounded really conservative when you were saying that, but I wouldn't describe you that way.
Honestly, I don't find talking about community as conservative,
Good
because
for you.
I think supportive communities, having friends, having family somewhere close to you, it may be a family of choice. It may be your gay bestie that's swinging by to take care of the kid when you go take Pilates or whatever. Like, you can have
Yeah.
a community around you, and that's not
Yeah.
necessarily a conservative thing.
It's an old world value that you're saying can have lots of new world forms. But I want to respond more about the best age for
Just on
childbearing.
that, though, on the old word
Yeah.
value, because I just want to pick at that for a second. What role can things like faith, religion, culture, can that also lead the way in terms of resurrecting the community?
I'd love to talk about that, but I also want to respond to this whole thing about age and whatever, and maybe I'll bring in religion in the process. So I hear you saying we need to make childbearing at a younger age. And I hear Alaka responding with, oh, whatever the solution is has to do with basically political processes. What we think is good or bad has to do with our politics, and it changes, and da da da. And I just want to get out there very clearly that I do believe that we have to respect the biological reality, that we may be able to delay parenthood through IVF, but it may not be infinitely malleable. I mean, after all, we are talking about birthing people with bodies, and we are embodied people, and our bodies matter, and we can't infinitely change them. So I think we should operate within the constraints. And along with the soulmate thing being an ideology that pushes marriage and parenthood later, I think the idea that I should get married and have children after my personality is fully developed is a very modern idea. And it's one that we don't challenge very often. I mean, I hear, oh, well, people under 25 are still having, their brains are still developing, so they shouldn't be making lifetime, life-altering decisions. What's the basis for that?
But at the same time, don't you think, because that's something that keeps popping up in my mind whenever
Yeah.
we bring this up, that don't you think that we can very easily slip into that harmful pro-natalist narrative that you are 27 and you're not pregnant yet, whatever you're doing with your life? It creates this blame and that expectation. So that's also a slippery slope.
Okay, responding to that might take me off where I was, but that's okay because I love what you said. I think we need to also differentiate between individual rights and individualism per se, because I don't hear any of us saying that coercion with respect to childbearing is morally acceptable. I just don't hear it. But I do hear a lot of, well, this works for some people and this works for other people. And of course, that's true. There's going to be some relativism. But I also want to embrace the fact that, and I guess it's back to the biological reality, that some stuff you can't change just by having a preference. And that earlier childbearing, I think, is shied away from in part because of the idea that I have to be fully developed as an individual before I let someone else change who I am by being that intimate with them, either as a marital partner or as a mother or a father. That if I'm going to be that changed by another person, I better be pretty stable first. And I just think it reflects a rejection of our interdependence as human beings. We're social animals. We're moral social animals. We are interdependent on each other, and we don't recognize it often enough, I think. So in terms of like telling people the truth, yeah, I want to tell them there's a biological reality and that maybe freezing those eggs isn't the best idea, at least with the way the technology is right now. It might become better later. But I also want to tell them, you being the best person you can be is not the only goal in life. Your contribution to society can go well beyond your life project.
Well, yeah, but then at the same time, it would be good to have a general idea of a direction that you want to be going, at least mental health wise.
Oh,
Because that is an issue, that people who are not mature enough to become parents do become parents.
Oh.
And that is harmful to the idea of family, to the members of said family, and definitely to the children who then become the next generation who may actually decide to not have children because of their own
Negative
family trauma,
experience.
right? So it's
when,
not about having children
when you talk
early,
about
because that's
earlier
when you
children,
should
are
do
you
it.
talking about teen childbearing
No,
at
I'm
all?
not.
Either am I.
No.
Yeah. We're talking
Yeah, but
about
the-
childbearing in the 20s instead of the 30s
Yes.
for that first child.
Yes.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
at least sometimes people may need more time to figure things out.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, anything from building a community to going through therapy to getting medication and diagnosis, whatnot. So it may take some time. And I think I'm with Alaka on this, that it's putting pressure on having children at the right age, while biologically defendable, absolutely, and justified, opens a door that leads us to a very slippery slope. And that would require a very delicate dance to not create a very harmful environment for parenthood and to not slip into that coercion that we are talking about, that none of us agree with. But one thing is that none of us at this table agree with, and another is a narrative and policies that are created based on specific ideas
Fair
that
enough.
may lead to a very specific approach.
By the way, I love the idea that on that list of things that you said, of things that could help people feel like they were ready for parenthood, a reduction in consumerism might make that process easier, that you might be ready for childbearing earlier if you didn't have to have the piano lessons. I assume what you were saying at the beginning about piano lessons
Yeah.
was that is something we could let go. It doesn't have to be that intense. A parenting, not everybody, and nothing against piano lessons. Music is a wonderful thing, but the idea that you have to be able to provide them in order to be ready to have a child, that's what I'm talking about, not the piano lessons themselves. And workism. Who's talked the most about workism? I guess you have too. So the capitalism part went in with the workism part very well. So we could lower our material standards. And I think that it would be a wonderful thing for us as social animals to not be looking for the best amenities for ourselves. And that's a weird thing to say in a place like this, because I've had such lovely hospitality here. But these lovely things are not everything we need. We need people. We need embodied people. And
we need time. I
yes,
think that's what we are just lacking now.
yeah, one of
We
the
don't-
things I learned in graduate
Yeah.
school about what was missing from the GDP was unpaid labor, women's contributions, and leisure. No value is given to
Leisure, I
leisure.
think I've been trying to work on leisure now, and it really is something that we are paying too little attention. The whole point of being a working animal is to be able to have the time to do other things. that you-
Absolutely. And you know
that-
what? My own
yeah.
daughters preached that to me.
In the current social situation, rest is a revolutionary act, and having
Yes.
fun and enjoying oneself is a revolutionary
And
act.
enjoying
And
people.
enjoying others is also a revolutionary act. But that means, that sets wanted happy parenthood on that way of constant war, of fighting, of being an active revolutionary against a system. And that is an issue that we are bringing up, that if we agree on the fact that you do not need to be able to provide for your children, for your child to be the next Beethoven, but by the age of 4. But then again, if you give up some aspects of comfort of your life, some of your preferences, that creates a division between those who have children and those who don't have children. And that also leads to that binary division that I keep going back to, because we end up with the current situation, actually. People who don't have children, they might have pets, they might travel, they may be very happy with how they live their life, and they don't want to give that up because they see being a parent as something that's tiring. Because honestly, it is. It is tiring. That's at least how I imagine it as a parent to be at some point in my life, because it's being a constant revolutionary against the system. And so whenever we talk about the declining birth rates, we have to remember that this is first and foremost about the system and not the people, because the people live in the system and have to combat issues that are simply uncompatible if you're alone in this. And that is the responsibility of stakeholders and decision makers.
To me, that would make me optimistic if it's only the system. I think today we have created societies where delayed parenthood has become the norm, and even if the system changes, I'm not confident that we will ever go back to younger parenthood, and I don't see mathematically how that can therefore see our societies, frankly, emerge intact. I'd like to say something about community, though. I absolutely agree that community is essential. I was speaking to someone, maybe it was your university, Catherine Pakaluk,
Yes.
who's, I believe, 14 children between two marriages.
That's her husband that has 14. She only has 7.
I mentioned community
I
to
like that you're
her,
only 7.
and that I felt community was important, and she responded by saying, that's like telling people to be happy. You can't just create community. It's not like be happy, create a community. Communities have to come from somewhere, and I don't know where that's going to come from, but we're making it harder for ourselves. If you take nations, certainly across Europe, I imagine parts of Poland, certainly Japan, where shrinking birth rates have meant decimated communities. Japan has something like 6,000 schools that have closed in the last 15 plus years, 2 per day. 2 schools per day are closing in Japan. You close a school, you lose a community all around it. So what happens is younger parents move away. The older people tend to stay there because where the younger people are going to is more expensive. So you create these environments through falling birth rates. I call it the birth gap trap, that actually we have to swim upstream to recreate a sense of community in an environment where young people and are moving away. So we've got decaying societies against us here as well.
But wouldn't you agree that creating these systemic changes, I don't think there is a single fix. There is not one thing, that there is not a wave of a wand that we can do that will fix the situation, but it would be an improvement. It would create a new space for people to try and even ask themselves a question, well, do I want to be a parent?
We need dramatic changes, and I've got some things to share on that. I don't know if now's the right time.
Well, I was just going to say, I wish we had more time because
You're really
we
gonna
could
stop
keep.
us?
I really don't want to, I promise, but we could talk about this for hours. I really wish we had more time.
I believe we have talked
I
about it
would.
for hours.
I believe we have. I mean, a few more hours. But I want each of you to have a final word. And Stephen, please finish your point, but then do me one over. If you can let me know, for the young people who are listening to this, what do you hope to leave them with after this conversation? And I want to hear from all of you on that question. Go ahead, please.
So to finish my point first, I believe we need fundamental changes. Tinkering with policies has been tried and has not worked. We have to accept that. I think it means reinventing education. I'd like to see us change to lifelong learning. I'd like to take a year out of high school. I'd like to take a year out of college. And I'd like to see younger people be able to start working earlier, helping to define what they actually want to do long-term career-wise, but having that happen over future summers, future evening schools to get the qualification that's really valid. Now, in doing that, I think will enable people to have more independence earlier. I think career pathways need to change significantly as well. I think corporate employers and hiring people should happily give young people, men and women, extended time off to have a family, but retain that person as part of your staff. Keep giving them training, inviting them to the office parties, make them feel valued so when they're ready to come back. Now, that's going to be expensive. All these solutions are expensive, but I think enabling younger people to have more time to plan their lives and not cram everything into our early mid-20s in terms of education career has to be a fundamental part of this to me. In terms of what I'd like younger people to take away from this discussion is simply thinking about it. Talk to your friends, talk to your family members, and if you're in a relationship, talk about it, certainly in terms of timing for parenthood. And if the person you're with or hope to be with has a different time window to you, you should perhaps consider whether that's the right relationship for you.
Laurie?
Hard to sum up. However, I'm sort of going to respond to the call to frame this a little bit in terms of religion, because there is a legitimate and sincere concern that the more seriously religion is taken as a possible motivating force, the more likely it will be used to cause harm and to coerce. But we also have to, I believe, and I think I could defend this pretty well, embrace religion for its moral knowledge, for the way it calls us to not be all about ourselves and actually be for the other and for God. And so I think that God knows what people need, and they need each other. And we have these bodies, and we need to create new bodies for the next generation. I'm putting the emphasis on the body part again, just to say that part of the social reproduction has to include biological reproduction. I am all for cutting back on workism and capitalism, but it's not enough. I think we have to nurture what does Christian Smith call them? Moral, spiritual animals? I think I'm getting it wrong. But anyway, the just the people who value relationships, who value community, who are taught that you don't value community after you have your own individual act together, but that you act like a citizen of an interdependent world from the get-go. And that's doing chores at home and at school and being a good friend and being a good animal parent and so many other things. But I think that, like you said, not one thing is going to change it. We can restructure society with policy levers. Like, for instance, one of the ones that Philip Longman's put forth is, this applies to the United States very well, don't have payroll taxes for people with 3 or more children. So you'd still pay income tax, but you wouldn't do Social Security and Medicare, which are taking care of old people. And the reasoning behind that is, if you are bodily contributing to the next generation, then you don't necessarily have to do it financially, which might cause less of a division, like you were talking about, between the ones that are and the ones who aren't. It's like, well, you're going to make a choice which way you would prefer to contribute, out of your pocketbook or out of your very own body. And I'm saying that for both men and women, but obviously much more profoundly for women. So my sum up thing would be to say that when I talk about the age structure as a common good, it's not just workers, although it is workers, because they do generate good stuff when they work. But it's not an endorsement of workism, and that it's not just about production either. It's that I believe that we are our best selves as interdependent people. And the more we buy the lie that we are our best selves when we're true to ourself, and that self should be individually defined and not defined by your relationship with God, your relationship with your children, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your gay friends, your relationship with your straight friends. If you're supposed to be an individual, I think we're lost from the beginning. I don't think that we were created to be individuals. We are moral, social animals. And we can't deny it, just like we can't deny what age might work best for childbearing, mathematically.
Alaka?
Yeah, I think I brought this up at the beginning, but I'm saying it again, that I think we are more than individuals. We are social beings. That's important. But we are not, which is what social life has been reduced to. We are not Americans versus Nigerians versus Hindus versus Muslims, whatever it is. And actually, to me, the nationalism that motivates much of this pro-natalist talk and motivated the anti-natalist talk earlier is something very disturbing. That it's so. In fact, was it John F. Kennedy who said, "Ask not what you can do, what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do." I think we need to reverse that. We should not be asking people to do things as a patriotic duty, which is what a lot of this population pro-natalism and anti-natalism has been about. So I would ask, what can the state, after all, we've elected these people to power, what can they do for people so that the individual can flower, which is what you said. And I think flower must mean what you said, which is in any direction. I don't think there need to be, I do no harm is do no harm, I accept, but beyond that, I think we need space for all kinds of preferences, all kinds of aspirations. And by aspirations, I don't mean the amount of money you can earn, but I just mean the ability to do other things. And so the state, I think, is morally bound to do things for its citizens more than citizens are bound to do things for the country. And to me, that's an important lesson that young people need to demand from the state, that give us a sense of security, give us a sense of non-exclusion, and a sense of being a part of humanity. And we will deliver, I think, in return. I think they will, without even thinking about it, deliver what is good for all of us.
Antonina, what do you hope young people take away from this conversation?
Well, when talking to young people, I usually say, be rebellious. Be brave and be rebellious, because the system is broken and we need to fix it. And it's up to us. I'm 29. I started in the activist field when, goodness, I was 18. And we can do it. Do not let anyone rain on your parade. Do not let anyone diminish you. If you see something that needs to be fixed, be brave and try to fix it, and seek out people who may want to do the same with you. And don't let anyone ever tell you that you're not smart enough, that you don't have a seat at the table. Because when talking about the future, we are talking about the world of the younger people. And we have a vision, and we have a voice, and we have an idea. And the system is currently playing for itself rather than for us. And so if it means that we have to change our ways, do that. It's scary. It's difficult. It's very easy to say it, sitting at a table and having this brilliant discussion today. But honestly, if you want change, you can take that first step. Seek out your people. Be brave. Be vulnerable. Talk. Listen to others. Be open. And first and foremost, dare to enjoy. Because life is to be enjoyed. If you want to be a parent, enjoy that. If you need more time and want to explore yourself, take that gap year. If you want to have the time for yourself, if you want to contribute to others in another way, volunteer, seek out others, go visit that sisters or grandma or someone who may need you to even bring hot chicken soup because there is no one else to do that. Just be a member of community, even if it's very seemingly insignificant. I guarantee that participation matters and being rebellious matters. Because if there is something in front of you that's standing on very strong foundations, just, taking a step back and going in full force will only hurt you. You have to nibble on that foundation. Take a little piece and take a little piece. And the more there is of us, the bigger the chance that that flawed giant will actually collapse. And it applies to birth rates, of course, and to wanted happy parenthood and families, but it applies to life in general. So my message to the young people would be rebellious.
Thank you so much. I have to agree with Antonina that this was a brilliant discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.